Good afternoon and welcome to another News for You live stream brought to you by Freedom Media WA. I can see that I am live on all three platforms, Facebook, YouTube and Rumble. And joining me now, as you can probably see from the screen in the background, is the Honourable Nick Goiran. And we have a lot to talk about. I'll just bring up this just here. Again, thank you very much, Nick, for joining the Freedom Media platform and talking to people here. I just need to perhaps duck back behind the scenes just to have a look and see why I'm getting the double image there.
Well,
Always...
Lindsay, that would be Labor's worst nightmare, the Cook Labor government.
Two Nick Goirans.
Yeah.
I think that may have sorted it. I'll just double check. So here we go. Yes, Labor's worst nightmare there, as you say, having not one, but two Nick Goiran asking the questions that do need to be asked. So I am just waiting to see that there are some comments coming through, but it does look good on the stream, and I've just lost the mic pack, so here we go. Yeah, as I said, thank you very much again, a very busy man. And this stream, as you can see, is having a closer look at the next sitting. Parliament sits next Tuesday. And Nick, a lot happened in the last sitting. There's a couple of discussion points that I will be touching on and that you have posted about this as well, but perhaps more conversation on many issues needs to be had on some of these topics. And I'm just going to kick off and just see that those that have followed some earlier streams that I've done in the week would have noticed that I did pick up on the notice paper that there was a motion being introduced by the WA Greens, that's Brad Pettit, and he was looking to introduce a motion to cease gas cancellations. Firstly, I'm just going to bring up and have a look at the people there hopefully can see that is the motion there at the very top, the elimination of gas in residential buildings. So Nick Goiran, please give us an update as to what you know about that particular motion.
Yeah, thanks very much, Lindsay. It is the case that any member of the WA Upper House is at liberty at any time to give notice of a motion. That is, a motion that they would like to have the Upper House debate. And the Honourable Brad Pettit from the Greens approximately a year ago gave notice of that outrageous motion that you've referred to, the idea that somehow in Western Australia we would ban gas connections in new residential homes. Now, at the time, might have sounded quite outrageous, but as perhaps viewers might be aware, this type of outrageous policy has actually manifested itself in Victoria. So there was a great danger that perhaps Mr. Pettit would bring that particular motion forward this coming Wednesday. Viewers might wonder why this particular Wednesday is of special importance. The simple explanation is that each of the political parties in Western Australia's Upper House get a effectively rostered allocation of time. The Greens were rostered on for this coming Wednesday. So essentially they get to control the agenda for the Upper House for 2 hours this Wednesday morning in accordance with their rostered time. Mr. Pettit could have brought this ridiculous gas motion on, and I can inform you that that is no longer happening. It's up to him to explain why he has abandoned that, but I, for one, am pleased that he has done that, and instead he is moving a motion calling on the Cook Labor government to do something about the homelessness crisis we have in Western Australia.
And another very, very important issue, and I guess, thank you, I'm just going to do a quick call out to Terry and Richo, two regulars to the platform, just some reassuring comments this end, that everything's looking good. Terry is noting the initial start of the stream, saying that there was a double Nick Goirans, so which will be a good thing if we can have not one but two interviews in one particular time. You did mention that he is changing that particular motion, and as you've touched on, the gas ban is something that they've done in Victoria. I'm just going to bring just a very short package on how Channel 7 in Victoria have actually introduced that particular gas ban.
Victorians are facing a major energy shake-up with a ban on gas in all new homes set to kick in from the start of next year. It means new homes will have to use electric appliances, triggering fears that thousands of jobs could be lost.
In just 5 months, this won't be heard in any new builds in Victoria.
From the 1st of January 2024, all new residential buildings that require a planning permit will be all electric.
All electric means gas will be banned in all new homes or renovations that require a planning permit.
This is a great day. It's a great day for taking.
So we can see there that it's cited as a great day in terms of banning gas. So we're back to the double nick. I know exactly what that issue is now, so I'm just going to fix that behind the scenes. And just excuse me one moment. I am running solo today, so that, so as we touched on there, the comments, and we still have that, so that should change us. So there we go. So in talks, I mean, the motion is not going ahead today, but would it be fair to say that this is a clear indication of what is coming down the pipeline? Would you agree with that sentiment?
Well, I think that's absolutely fair to say, Lindsay, certainly from the Greens. Now, in fairness, the Cook Labor government now haven't had an opportunity to put formally their position on the record in Parliament because this debate will no longer happen this Wednesday. But I would like to see all of the serious political players in Western Australia categorically and unequivocally rule this out. This is madness. Viewers will recall not that long ago that Western Australians were being urged to convert to gas, in part because it is a good thing to do for our environment. And now to have the suggestion that somehow gas is almost an immoral thing to be associated with is just completely disproportionate. And I'm glad to see that debate is not even longer going to be happening in the West Australian Parliament this week. We have other priorities we need to get on with rather than talking about the absurdity of banning gas.
Absolutely, and I think moving on to one of the many things that I would like to talk to you about, and I did observe, Nick Goiran, that both on your platform but also on the WA Parliament live website, going back to last month, that there was a very interesting exchange that you had with the WA Police Commissioner. And I'm sure that you would probably understand. If I may just take a quick, to bring those that perhaps haven't seen that footage, I've got about sort of 15 seconds that will pretty much bring you up to speed. I'm just going to play that now.
The Honourable Nick Goiran.
Turning to a different topic then, Minister, it is the case that during this financial year, temporary emergency powers were shifted from you in your other capacity as Minister for Emergency Services to the Police Commissioner, pursuant to the Emergency Management Amendment Temporary COVID-19 Provisions Act of 2022. Has the Police Commissioner invoked any of these powers?
Minister.
No.
I'm in regular contact with the Chief Health Officer. I talk to the Chief Health Officer on regular occasion. There were structured meetings for a lot of the time after the end of the state of emergency. So there's no structure whether I contact him or he me. If we both feel that there's a conversation that is required based on reporting of COVID matters, then that conversation will occur.
The Honourable Nick Goiran.
Because in the Act itself, it doesn't necessarily, as I recall, and I have to check my records, prescribe some specific function around the Chief Health Officer. I think it's directed at yourself to have those powers. And I appreciate that at the time that COVID was rife, that there would have been regular meetings, probably even daily meetings and the like. How regularly are you meeting with the Chief Health Officer nowadays?
Commissioner.
Thank you. Just to clarify on the rules or the prescription that he must put his health advice in writing to me for me to enact those powers. Probably these days, I might call him once a month.
The Honourable Nick Goiran.
Once a month. And that written advice that he has to provide to you, that's only if you request it, though. He has to put it in writing if you request it.
Commissioner.
If I'm going to go down the path of using those powers.
So I think, I'll just stop there. It must have just added a little bit that I went to take out. But I think it sets up to my question to yourself. When I watched it, I think that went back to the 22nd of July, that you had the opportunity to question the police commissioner on that. Nick Goiran, my understanding right then, at the last point that we just saw of that package, that you were actually bringing the police commissioner up to speed with what the Act says that the government rammed through because they had the numbers last year, that he actually wasn't aware that the health advice needed to come from the Chief Health Officer only on his request. That's how it appeared to me.
Yeah, look, I can understand how that appeared, Lindsay, because in that particular hearing, for the benefit of viewers, once a year, the Western Australian Upper House has what's called budget estimates hearings. Now, it sounds by its name to be somewhat of a boring topic, but it's actually incredibly important because it enables Upper House members to effectively cross-examine ministers and bureaucrats in any government department or agency, not just with respect to their budget in terms of what's in it and what's out of it, but how they are managing those funds. So in this particular instance, and that package of viewing that you provided, it had to do with West Australian Police. But you see, the West Australian Police Commissioner, in a bizarre situation that we find ourselves here in Western Australia, is not only the Police Commissioner, but he also has at his disposal these so-called temporary COVID emergency powers. And so the purpose of the questions that I was asking at the time was to ascertain to what extent he has actually used those. Pleasingly, he indicated he has not invoked them. The question, of course, then arises, well, why does he have them at this time? I had argued at the time when they were ramming that legislation through that it was unjustified, disproportionate use of emergency powers. Well, some time has passed on now, and if the police commissioner has never needed to use it, I think we can certainly tear them up and put them in the waste paper basket, if I can put it that way. They are due to expire at the end of next year. That is a good thing. I mean, I don't think they should be in there in the first place. I think they should be torn up now, but at least there is a sunset clause. My concern is whether Roger Cook, the new replacement Premier, will he seek to extend those emergency powers when they expire at the end of next year? Now, I have asked his predecessor, Mr. McGowan, and now he himself, whether they will give an unequivocal commitment in that respect, and neither of them have been prepared to do that. So I am concerned about that, and it is a topic that I continue to pursue them on until such time as we see these unnecessary COVID emergency powers thrown in the bin.
And I will point out in that particular package, you did actually go on, you put that question to the police commissioner to ask him, does he anticipate an extension of that? And that particular line of questioning was very quickly shut down by Steve Dawson in relation to, saying that it wasn't appropriate that you asked him that question, yet the government wanted the police to come into Parliament, as you've just highlighted. And then what viewers may also not know is that you then said that you would be exploring that a little bit further, and he was very clear, the Minister of Emergency Services, that you won't get a further answer. He hasn't made a decision in relation to that.
Yeah, no, that is exactly right. And how outrageous that was, Lindsay. You see, the WA Labor government shifted responsibility for emergency powers from them, the government, who quite rightly resides with. I have said repeatedly that whoever is in government needs to, at certain times, have emergency powers. Why? Because sometimes there are genuine cases of emergencies, like when there are floods or fires or some kind of natural disaster of that sort. The problem that we had is we had a government using emergency powers in a state of emergency while they had ministers trotting around the globe trying to promote Western Australia and telling them to come here as a tourist destination. It is a nonsense to be using emergency powers while you're trying to get tourists to come to our state. So pleasingly, that state of emergency declaration ceased. They then, in a very shifty fashion, sent those powers to the police commissioner. And that's where it resides at the moment. That should never have happened. And if they are going to give him those emergency powers, then he needs to be held accountable for them. But as you say, then the Minister for Emergency Services, ironically enough, stepped in, shut down the questioning. And I'd like to know, is the police commissioner, is he advocating for the extension of these emergency powers? Now, I hope he's not. I hope that he quite genuinely recognises and says to government that there is actually no need for him to have them at the moment. I hope that's the conversation that's happening behind closed doors. But how outrageous it is for the Cook Labor government to shut down that questioning. And if they want to do that, then they themselves need to step up and unequivocally rule out any extension.
And there are, for your benefit, Nick Goiran, on the stream, some people saying, thank goodness in WA that we have the likes of yourself that has the finger on the pulse and continue maintaining and asking questions on this. Of course, there was a lot, I did stream a lot of what you had to say in Parliament over questioning this bill at the time. Not so much to unpack that, but I will say as an observation, that when you talk about the emergency powers, it seemed that for, let's say, 70-80% of the pandemic, that they were able to manage the pandemic adequately with the legislative powers that were in place prior to this bill. So very valid question. And I guess thank you for the viewers for asking this. Just one comment there saying that you're cooking on gas, Nick, and turn up the heat. That's one of the comments coming through. Can I ask you, Nick, looking forward, as I indicated at the start of this stream, what does next week see for you in WA Parliament?
Look, it's an interesting week in the WA Parliament that will start on Tuesday. We're sitting Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday next week. Two very different sets of priorities in the lower and the upper house. The upper house is likely to be spending most of its week on new workers' compensation laws, an important area to make sure that injured workers in Western Australia have adequate access to compensation, particularly in circumstances where they're injured through no fault of their own. And so I will be scrutinising the government's legislation. It's some 700 clauses, a massive piece of legislation. That'll be primarily what I expect that the upper house will be consumed with. In the lower house, it'll be also an important and perhaps far more controversial or sensitive debate that will be taking place in respect to abortions in Western Australia. Of course, this is not anything new. Western Australia has had a legalised regime for 25 years. These are some amendments that the Health Minister wants to push through. Whatever people might think about that regime, obviously there's going to be strong feelings within the West Australian community. I guess the point I would make is that I do find it a bit odd that this is the number one priority for the Cook Labor government for the lower house this week. I would have thought that there were other health crisis, hospital crisis, and other more pressing matters to be dealing with. But look, it's up to them what they want to push through the lower house, and that's what their priority is.
It does seem two important issues, and they are social issues, and people that visit the CBD would see over the past 12, 16 months of certainly since the McGowan government, now the Cook government, or the Labor government, I should say, in Western Australia, and probably an alarming trend across the nation, the increase of homelessness, not an issue to be taken lightly, and it's one that they well and truly could have tackled not just next week, but 15 months ago. Where was the government's concern then? You mentioned about the abortion. Again, that is an issue that it can, and as you know, very controversial, and people will have very, very limited views. Not trying to detract from either of those two views, Nick Goiran, would you say, or what would you say in relation to, is this a distraction to take away from the absolute, what's the way to say it, balls up, let's call it, as I would say it, for the implementation of the Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Act?
Oh, most definitely, Lindsay. Let's make no mistake here. That is exactly what is going on here. The word I would use is shambolic. The rollout of the
Probably
new
more appropriate.
Aboriginal cultural heritage laws has been nothing short of a debacle. It has been shambolic. And the government, particularly hot on the heels of a very bad by-election in Rockingham. Keep in mind that Parliament hasn't sat since June. We've hardly been sitting much this year, such as the arrogance of this government, but at least we're back into it next week. There has been a 23% swing against the government in its best seat in the state, in Rockingham. So they are very obviously politically stressed about that and seeking to distract and deflect from this shambolic debacle around the Aboriginal cultural heritage regulations. And so they've gone to this particular topic. Now, I think that is a shame. As I say, people will have strong views on that particular issue, including myself. None of those things are a secret. But at the end of the day, what is impacting the most of Western Australians at the moment, particularly anyone with a slice of property of more than 1,100 square metres, they will be impacted by these laws. They are captured by these new regulations. And what is the Cook Labor government doing about that? Well, nothing much. In fact, their minister has been reported as saying that everything's going smoothly. Now, I just find that absolutely unbelievable that a minister could, with a straight face, suggest that this shambolic debacle is going smoothly. We've got local governments and environmental groups who have had to stop tree planting because of a concern over these new Aboriginal cultural heritage laws. Now, if a West Aussie can't even plant a tree out of concern of litigation or otherwise, we've got a problem. And there's certainly nothing smooth about that whatsoever. So the government, this is all very inconvenient, and so they like to put up their smoke screens and the like. That's what we're going to see next week in Parliament. Nevertheless, the opposition and myself will continue to press these matters whenever we can get the opportunity.
And Nick Goiran, in my view, you've touched on and the elephant in the room, let's say, and that is in relation to the cancellation of the tree planting. And what most people may be aware of by now, or should be aware of, is that in addition to the confusion around whether it needed a cultural survey in order for that to take place, if you set that issue aside, it was a claim to, I think it was in the order of $2.5 million in order for that endorsement to go ahead. I mean, is that how you see it, or is?
And that should never have happened. And if I can be as charitable as possible to the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, he himself is reported as saying that was wrong and shouldn't have happened. Well, that's terrific that he has come out and said that. But that's of no comfort to those local governments, to those groups, to the ordinary Western Australian who is completely confused by this shambolic debacle. And the problem is greater than that, Lindsay, because it'll be very convenient for the minister and Mr. Cook to come along and say, well, Western Australians need to educate themselves in respect to these laws. Well, you need to be virtually a law professor to be able to understand them in the first instance. And secondly, it's not of any use to you if, as a user of services, those service providers balk at providing a service to you. So let's say, for example, you're trying to do some form of development on your home. You need a service provider to come and see you. Maybe you've got a vacant lot, as I say, and it's more than 1,100 square metres. Any of those service providers at the moment are very stressed about the state of these laws. They're unsure, and they basically say, and I'm getting constituents day in, day out, come to me and saying this, they say, sorry, we're not going to take your job on. And they go and move to the next job, which is done on a property which is less than 1,100 square metres. Now, you can understand for the supplier of those services why they would come to that conclusion. It's going to be a lot easier for them and less risk involved. So it is clear that there is a major problem here in Western Australia. We need Mr. Cook, Mr. Booty, that's the Premier and the Minister, to roll up their sleeves and sort this fiasco out as an emergency. Now, one way in which they can do that is they can support the opposition's motion to repeal the regulations. Now, they could do that next week. We could get this done on Tuesday if there was a will by government. We're going to see what happens this week. If I look into my crystal ball, I suspect the outcome is going to be that they'll have delayed it for the entirety of the week. But viewers should be under no illusion the Cook Labor government could tear these Aboriginal cultural heritage regulations up on Tuesday with the support of the opposition if they wanted to. Let's see what happens this week.
Can I ask you, Nick, a man that does understand the law, as well as obviously you've held that portfolio as the Shadow Attorney General here for Western Australia. So the law has been your bread and butter for most of your career, both prior to Parliament and in Parliament. Could you just perhaps explain to those the difference between the Act and the regulations and the significance of what you're saying, that there is an opportunity to fix this problem next Tuesday?
Yeah, look, thanks, Lindsay, because that is something that is not usually understood. Every Act is passed by Parliament, and it must be passed by both houses of Parliament. But an Act is different to a regulation. A regulation is what is referred to as subsidiary legislation. If you like, you could consider it as secondary legislation instead of primary legislation. And it is the government of the day. It's got nothing to do with the Cook Labor government. Whoever is in government, they have the power to make these regulations. Now, what's happened in this particular instance is that the Cook Labor government have issued these regulations, which they are empowered to be able to do because they are in government. But the catch is this: Parliament has the capacity to repeal them, and it can be moved in either house. In this case, in the Legislative Council, there is a motion, and so long as the Legislative Council agrees to what's called a disallowance motion, then these regulations will be scrapped instantly. Now, that could happen on Tuesday. It's really up to the government when that happens. I suppose the good news is that they can't delay it forever. Under the laws of Parliament, it will have to be done by October. But October's so far away. Why do we need to continue to have this shambolic debacle rolling out between now and October? This should be dealt with straight away. Let's see what happens this week.
Yeah, it would be a brave government to come out and say that, look, we made a mistake at this particular point, but one that there's a number of opportunities as I see it here, and I'd be very interested to see how you see this. Firstly, you've said, Nick Goiran, that this problem could be fixed by addressing the regulations next Tuesday. Secondly, in terms of public perception and how the public would perceive the Premier Cook, who hasn't been off to a good start, I think that would be the best way to describe it, to come out and say, you know what, there was a lot going on. We had Mark McGowan stand down, suddenly, and we really do think that we're going to regroup, press pause on this. Of course, he had opportunity to do this with the 30,000 plus signatory petition that Neil Thompson tabled, and he chose not to do that. He regurgitated some quite unparliamentary comments around that. Is this an opportunity? Can he see this opportunity in your view?
Look, I agree, Lindsay. I think that what we would all like to see, irrespective of our political colours, is we would like to see what is best for Western Australia. We would like to see Western Australia thrive. And how refreshing would it be if we had a political leader who authentically stepped forward and said, I've been persuaded on this particular matter. Now, as you say, it might be considered to be a brave leader who does that, but how refreshing it would be. Isn't that what we actually want to see, is authenticity in our parliament, authenticity in our leaders, rather than this fake and phony attitude that we see at times. Worse when it's the arrogance and the vilification that comes the way of people who dare question the decisions of government. One must never forget that governments, parliaments, in fact, any of us as individuals, none of us are infallible. So when somebody raises a question or a concern, we should have the good grace and the humility to be able to listen to that, and if it is persuasive, to shift. But what we have seen with Mr. Cook so far in his 5 minutes as the replacement Premier is actually the opposite, is a vilification to people. The ego has been gigantic and the arrogance has been overwhelming. So, look, it is an opportunity for him to change his approach. You'll just have to forgive me if I'm not going to hold my breath.
And I must say that it's not the first time that I've heard you say that. I think there was something similar the last time that we had the opportunity to speak with you on the steps of Parliament House. I do want to make an observation, and I have touched on this. I did get the opportunity to speak to Russell Broadbent, the member for Monash, the federal member for Monash, on the mis and disinformation bill and his thoughts on that. And those that would watch the platform would know that I mentioned that recently there was a meeting of some 200 farmers that come together down in Katanning. I've since, stand corrected in relation to that, and it was over 500 farmers that came together. The point, Nick Goiran, that I made to Russell was saying for 500 farmers over the spatial distance between those properties and those 500 farmers, that's a significant amount of territory for them to cover, a significant amount of distance for them to, again, cover, and something that appears to be falling on deaf ears. It's almost incomprehensible that the Cook government is not reading the room in relation to that.
Yeah, and it shouldn't actually be about the volume of concern, but I agree with you that where there is that volume of concern, that quantity of concern, that it should add extra weight, and a responsible government would sit up and take notice because of the quantity and the volume of concern. But ultimately, it shouldn't rely on that. If one person comes forward and raises a legitimate concern, then a responsible government would take that on board and address that matter. They would seek to, if you like, facilitate rather than to frustrate. But what we have here is the complete opposite. At least that was the case before Parliament went into the winter recess in June. Let's see what happens next week when we resume.
And you've mentioned many times you've been probing the gold standard of transparency, which seems to be the lead weight of a sinker, and looking forward, Nick Goiran, for the week in Parliament. Are you able to provide an update, the parliamentary inquiry in relation to the government's management of the pandemic? Have you had any feedback in relation to that?
So when we last were sitting, Lindsay, it was those budget estimates hearings, quite a significant number of questions were taken on notice by the government. I sometimes wonder how prepared they really are when it comes to these parliamentary hearings. Nevertheless, they took them on notice. Those answers are now due. And so when we come back to Parliament, we should be seeing those answers flowing through the system. I would be hopeful that we would be seeing a ream of questions, or sorry, I should say answers, by Thursday of this week. So again, let's wait and see what happens. I mean, if not, I certainly will be pursuing it, but I imagine by Thursday we'll see some answers coming through.
Yeah. And to take that on another particular issue, have you had any further update in relation to the advice that the McGowan, now Cook government received on the voice to Parliament?
Well, they just simply won't provide it. I mean, they have put up all of the shields and defences, and under no circumstances, it appears, do they want Western Australians to be able to see what this advice is. Now, I might quickly add here, Lindsay, that sometimes people get confused between the advice that Mr Albanese has been hiding and this advice that we're talking about here in Western Australia. Now, it's already well known that Mr Albanese has been hiding advice. He released some of it, but not all of it. But what we're talking about here for the sake of Western Australians is that a responsible Western Australian government would get advice as to what impact is going to be felt here in our state if we do have a Canberra federal voice. Now, if that happens, it's going to have a direct impact upon Western Australians, the West Australian Parliament, the West Australian government. Now, I asked Mr McGowan to release that advice. He refused. In fact, I asked him twice. He refused twice. Since then, I've asked his replacement, Mr Cook, to do that. He has also refused. There is a massive petition that was tabled in Parliament by me on this issue. That is currently before a parliamentary committee for investigation. I have put in my submission as a joint submission with the principal petitioner. We're now waiting for the government's response. Look, it would be nice if that happened this week. I wouldn't really be able to predict whether it happens this week or not, but it is being pursued. And what really concerns me here, Lindsay, is can you imagine what a disgrace it would be if this secret advice that they refused to release to Western Australians on The Voice was released after the referendum? There would be absolutely no point in that whatsoever. We should see the advice now before we cast our vote. I know there'll be a lot of people who'll be saying, look, I'm voting no anyway. Terrific. As it so happens, I agree with them. There'll be others who will be saying, no matter what, I'm voting yes. Well, that as is their right. But my concern is for those people who are unsure. I want them to be able to see this advice that the government's keeping secret.
And I think that the thing, and you've touched on this previously as well, and I just want to reiterate that particular point, is that this advice, if there was a question of ownership over this advice, does it belong to the Cook government or his cabinet, or does it belong to the people of Western Australia? And that's really where, as I understand it, the point that you're trying to make in relation to this.
Yeah, and it is owned, if you like, by the Cook Labor government. They sought the advice, and so it is their advice. However, and this is a big however, under the laws of our state, Section 82 of the Financial Management Act directs that if a government refuses to provide information to Parliament, because keep in mind at the end of the day, Parliament has a job to oversee and hold accountable executive government. If a government refuses to provide information to Parliament, then it must, as a matter of law, provide a notice to the Auditor General. And the Auditor General then acts as an umpire, if you like.
Yes.
They get to see the advice and they get to then determine and give an opinion as to whether that advice was reasonably withheld, because perhaps there was some, great matter of, let's imagine at a federal level, national security that might justify that. Or could it have been provided in a redacted form, etc. But they give an opinion. The umpire gives an opinion. But you see, the Cook Labor government won't even let the umpire see the advice. They won't even let the umpire make a decision. Such is the arrogance and the contempt. And so that's why we've had to resort to the petition and seek a parliamentary inquiry. So hopefully we'll get there in the end. But as I say, Lindsay, my fear is that this is taking so long, it's all going to happen after the referendum.
And really, the more I hear you talk on this, the more I read, the more I listen to how it's been covered by mainstream media. You know, opposition does have a role, and that is to oppose the government. And you're not opposing for the sake of simply trying to be obstructing what the government's trying to achieve. You're simply trying to point out things that the government really should be telling if they do want to be compliant, as you've just mentioned, in relation to the financial, I think it was the Financial Administration Act or something.
Financial Management. Yeah, Financial Management Act. That's right, and all
Yep.
I would like to see is the government abide by the rule of law in Western Australia.
Yes.
They have a duty to act as the best possible, if you like, corporate citizen. They should be the leaders in our community in following the law. They shouldn't thumb their nose at the law. And if they have a duty, which they do, under Section 82 of the Financial Management Act, to provide a notice to the Auditor General so that she can make a determination, so whether it's fair and reasonable that they are hiding this information from Parliament, then they should comply with that. You can't expect West Aussies to comply with the law of the land when you're a government that doesn't even comply with it themselves. So it is incredibly frustrating, and they're quite right. All I'm asking for them is to adhere to the rule of law.
Yes.
At the moment, they haven't been doing that.
You've mentioned the homeless, you've mentioned abortion. That is and I would say this, the distraction that the government seems to be tabling next week to take away from the Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Act, which, again, can be solved on Tuesday by addressing the regulations. Is there anything else on the notice paper for next week, Nick Goiran, that you see as potentially, that the people of Western Australia should know about?
Look, they are the key things, as I say. In the upper house, it's going to be likely the workers' compensation laws. In the lower house, it's going to be the abortion laws. The Greens have got their motion with respect to a plea for ending homelessness. They're really the critical issues that I think we're going to see over the course of this week. But behind the scenes will be the work that comes out of the Standing Committee on Estimates and Financial Operations. That's the one committee in this Parliament that's not controlled by the government. That's the committee that I serve on. And there will be information that comes out of that as a result of those hearings that we had in June. So I think they're the key things for this week.
And can I perhaps bring up something that I do see on the notice paper, that you are seeking to address e-petitions and the remarks that the Premier Cook said in relation to those e-petitions. Is that something that I can explore? Nick, would you like to make some comment in relation to that?
Well, only simply, Lindsay, to say that won't come on this week. And the explanation for that is what I was saying earlier, that any upper house member can give notice, which I have done, but then it's a case of the rostered allocation time. This week's roster goes to the Greens, and so they get to control that agenda for 2 hours. The purpose of me putting that motion on the record very quickly was because of the incredibly intemperate remarks by the replacement Premier, Mr Cook, for him to vilify people who were concerned about these new Aboriginal cultural heritage laws was simply, it was really disgraceful behaviour on his part. It was not statesmanlike in the slightest, and something needed to be said. I note that this week he has been quite quick, and I think he's done the right thing in that respect in condemning some of the behaviour that has happened at a home of a private citizen in Western Australia. Some environmental activists have plainly acted improperly, and quite unbelievably, there was the ABC videoing all of this. To his credit, he has called out that bad behaviour. That is excellent, and he has my support for that. But I would like him to also comply by his own standards and not be vilifying other people when they raise concerns about his decisions.
You touch on something that I have been following, that particular issue, the Woodside CEO and the protest action there as well. And I've simply been keeping my finger on the pulse in relation to that because I was very interested what the Federal Minister for Communications, Michelle Rowland, said in response to the ABC. And I guess to bring people up to speed with this and without diving too deeply into it, that the ABC were actually on the ground in attendance before the police arrived, which does lead to the question, how did the ABC know this? And was there a obligation for the ABC to at least advise the police that there potentially was going to be a protest of this nature that could, the gauge of extremity is one that could be subjective, but there is that type of obligation there. So, and her comments coming out on the back of her seeking to introduce a bill to have public discussion shut down on platforms like this, I found quite interesting. So I'm not sure, yeah, and but it is pleasing to hear that Premier Cook has echoed his concerns in relation to that. Nick Goiran, the other thing that I have seen as well is that there seems to be an additional application for expenditure for the Metronet. Is I think it's in the order of about $100 million plus.
Yes, there's a lot of information that's going to come out, I suspect, by Thursday this week. And that's because of those questions that were taken on notice during those budget estimates, parliamentary hearings in June. My best guess is that the information starts to come out on Thursday and we'll have, I think, much more to talk about after that. Yeah.
And okay, so and I guess another busy couple of weeks of Parliament for yourself, Nick. Thank you very much for your time. I do also note that you will be appearing in the Church and State tomorrow, I think, and those that may be interested in that can go over to your Facebook page. Do you still have the discount promo in relation for that?
I don't, but certainly people would be able to do that. It may well be sold out now, Lindsay, but that's a conference that I'm attending and speaking at tomorrow. So looking forward to that. And then, as you say, it's going to be a busy fortnight in Parliament. Let's see what answers we can extract out of the government.
There's, and I'm just also casting a note on any comments that perhaps if I get opportunity for one question to perhaps put to you from those watching. There is plenty of conversation, Nick, talking about the surprise or nothing surprises people with the conduct of the ABC, not only with that particular issue, but just in general. It seems that the public broadcaster funded by the taxpayer has certainly shifted, well, the pendulum swung to the left in my view. That's quite clear. So, yes, we certainly, and I'll be watching myself with anticipation to see the continued questions that you ask. I'm just trying to see, there's one comment coming through. There's a couple coming through now, making it a little bit difficult to pick up. But, Nick Goiran, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for the explanation for those that have watched, in particular, the difference between the Act and the regulations. I think that's an important thing. For me, the issue right there is that the government has an opportunity to fix this debacle on Tuesday by addressing the regulations. And that that is something that, hopefully the public will get more of an understanding of that and come out and support those, not only, it's not only those that have properties above 1,100 square metres, but really the backbone of the West Australian primary production food supply, our farmers.
Exactly right. And as I say, that could just be done on Tuesday. And as much as the workers' compensation laws are important, there's no question about that. I couldn't, in my heart of hearts, really say to you that they were urgent. They clearly have not. These are reforms that started in 2014. So this has been around for 9 years. Whether we dealt with them this week or next week probably wouldn't make a big difference, whereas we could deal with the Aboriginal cultural heritage fiasco this week. But the government doesn't want to do that, so we may end up waiting till October. Let's wait and see.
Yes, let's wait and see. And again, just a few comments coming through in relation to The Voice. There's one there from Catherine talking about the workers' compensation. And probably, if I can just quickly, Nick Goiran, just pick up on that. You mentioned workers' compensation. That's something the government's looking at this week. Would it potentially extend, or could it potentially extend to vaccine injuries?
Well, Lindsay, this is a topic that I took up last month in budget estimates hearings, and quite unbelievably, the government has not provided 1 cent, $1, nothing with respect to adverse events following vaccination. This was the health budget. And I just find that quite remarkable, because whatever people may have thought about things a few years ago, the evidence is very clear, even out of the WA Labor government themselves. They were ultimately required to produce a report that was revealed in February this year, which showed a massive increase in adverse events. And disproportionate to the number that had taken place. Yes, of course, there were many more vaccinations that happened in 2021, we know that, but it was disproportionately more. Now, we're currently waiting for the 2022 report. Once again, there's a bit of trickery going on, because earlier in the year, I was told that the report would be released in July. Well, here we are, it's the 4th of August. Where is this report? Now, I asked last month about that. Is it still on target? Well, suddenly we're told that it's going to be available in August. So we've already got potentially 1 month's delay. So when we go back this week, I'll be asking for the release of the 2022 adverse events report. Let's see if we get it. Time will tell.
Yeah. And that's where we were a couple of minutes ago when I was about to sign off. Again, Nick Goiran, the honourable member for, I guess, your electorate there. You've certainly, and people are just saying thank you very much for your time as well, Nick, in providing some opportunity for people to ask questions, and for myself to ask questions as well. And I will just say, you know, you were quite busy supporting Peter Hudson for his attempts down in Rockingham to secure that seat. Perhaps not to wasted efforts. There's certainly been a significant shift away. 22%, I think, was the end result. There would have to be a few Labor backbenchers that would not have that margin, or half that margin, that potentially will be starting to see that maybe the tide has turned, and that's thanks to the likes of yourself, Nick Goiran. Thank you very much for your time. And I'm just going to run the intro package and sign off on the stream. Thank you very much, Nick.
Thank you very much. Cheers.
Brought to you by Freedom Media.